The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Last week, the whole world watched as large swaths of London were smashed, burned, and looted by lawless gangs of juvenile delinquents. It was Britain's worst rioting in more than a generation. It all began innocently enough as a small protest against a police shooting, but it quickly turned into an every-man-for-himself rampage through the streets of what was once the financial hub of the entire world. The pride of a once mighty empire upon which the sun never set. The police were totally unprepared for the attacks and shamefully unwilling to combat the thuggish criminality with the use of any kind of meaningful force. They were overwhelmed by the evil, and cities all across Britain were smashed as a result. It didn't take long for the unchecked violence and thievery in London to rapidly spread into other English cities with the assistance of social media tools. Let me read to you what columnist Melanie Phillips wrote during the crisis. This was on August 8th. She said, "What we are seeing in the sluggish and unprepared reaction of the police and political class to these events, compounded by their serial failure to grasp from previous such disturbances just what is going on here, is a catastrophic combination of professional inertia and incompetence, serial eyes off the ball, paralyzing political correctness, and apparent reluctance to identify, name, and deal with subversive activity, a capital's police force in systematic disarray, a criminal justice system that has become an insulting joke, a refusal from the top to draw clear lines in the sand and to exercise moral and political leadership, a pandering instead to mob rule." And she's right about that. You just don't see strong, upstanding leadership stepping forward during crises like these anymore. Instead, they end up exposing how weak and ineffective our leaders really are. And there's actually plenty of influential voices that defend these riotous acts as being some kind of natural response to government spending cuts or to poverty, as if it's sometimes understandable that poor, unemployed youths would smash up shops and steal tennis shoes. Notice what one London teacher who blogs for The Telegraph had to say about the anarchy on the streets of London. "The main reason you are not attacked on the street, shops are not constantly looted and burnt down, and we all don't take things that don't belong to us, is because someone, when we were little, taught us the difference between right and wrong." See, as she's getting at there, it all gets back to education. And education, of course, begins in the home with two parents, a loving father and mother. But when the family breaks down, as it obviously has in the United States, in Britain, then society starts to unravel. And that's what we're now witnessing. We're actually seeing the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 3 right before our eyes. Notice what Herbert Armstrong wrote in his book, The Missing Dimension in Sex. He said, "Since it is a basic truism that a solid family structure is the foundational bulwark of any stable and permanent society, this fact means only one thing: civilization as we know it is on the way down and out, unless that great, unseen, strong hand from someplace soon intervenes and saves today's sick society." Our Western society is upside down because the traditional, solid family unit is upside down. Going back to that London teacher's blog post, she said, "If you de-educate an entire generation, if you constantly make excuses for their behavior, if you never teach them the difference between right and wrong, then chaos is what you reap." We've been living, you see, in chaotic disorganized, selfish home environments. So why should we be surprised to see that chaos spill over into the streets? We are, quite simply, as she brings out, reaping what we have sown. She says, we are an international disgrace. I mean, that coming from a British school teacher. Think about that. Not long ago, Britain was the envy of the world. Today, it's an international embarrassment. She writes, these criminals are responsible for their behavior, but so are their parents who sit at home knowing their children are out there looking forward to the goodies their children will bring home. She says, I am so angry, so ashamed, so utterly dismayed. The vast majority of these criminals are black, she says. No one will say it. I hang my head in shame, both as a black person and as a teacher. See, at least this woman, a black woman, has the courage to say something. No one else will. Certainly no one among the leading voices in the white community. Most of our leaders won't even identify the nature of the problem, let alone attempt to solve the crisis. Now go and get your Bible and turn to Isaiah chapter 1. You can be sure that God has something to say about this. God knows what's happening here. In fact, He prophesied that these very events would happen in our day. In the Bible, God identifies the cause, and He shows us where this is all leading. As I say, notice Isaiah chapter 1 in verse 4 to begin with here today. It says, Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children that are corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord. They have provoked the Holy One of Israel unto anger. They are gone away backward. God refers to Israel, the descendants of Israel anciently, who are today in Britain, in the United States, in the little nation of Judah, or Israel today, and in other various nations as well. These are identified. These peoples are identified in the United States and Britain in prophecy. God speaks of Israel as a whole in this end time as His children, and how that these children have become corrupters, sadly. Corrupters. Not just because of their own sins. God doesn't just see them as corrupters and that's it. They're going about corrupting the rest of this world as well. That word corrupters can just mean decay or ruin or to perish. That's what we're bringing upon ourselves, and that's what we're spreading around the world as well. And this is why God is so upset. I mean, God wants us to set an example in righteous leadership, to set an example in righteous obedience to God and to His laws. Instead, though, we're leading the world in all of these sicknesses and all of these pathologies. We've become, as that woman brings out, an international embarrassment. Look at verse 5. It says, Why should you be stricken any more? You will revolt more and more. The whole head is sick. The whole heart, it says, faint. This is speaking primarily of the United States and Britain, the British people, and also the Jews of the Middle East. God is speaking primarily to these people because He raised them up, not because they were His favorites, but because He needed them to be an example. He needed them to be an example, as I said, in how to lead in righteousness and to obey God's laws faithfully. But instead, you see, there's sickness through and through. God, through His prophet, says the whole head is sick. That's talking about the leadership in Israel. The leadership, the head, what leads the rest of the body. It's sick, God says. Our leaders, most of them being white, our leaders, they just don't have the heart, you see, or the strength, as verse 5 brings out, to really stand up to these things. When we see our cities just falling apart, the heart is faint, as the end of verse 5 says. Melanie Phillips brings out how that the leaders today are just paralyzed by political correctness. They're reluctant, you see, to even identify the problem, as that other quote brought out, let alone to actually do something to deal with it. Why? Why is it that way? Well, because of what Isaiah prophesied. The whole heart is faint. There's weakness, there's timidity. You see it all through the leadership in Israel, and it's bringing not just the government down, but our nations along with it. Verse 6 says, "From the sole of the foot even unto the head there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. They have not been closed, neither bound up, neither mollified with ointment." So everything is sick, as these couple of verses bring out, from the head right down to the toe. But God does identify the sickness of the head to begin with. Those that ought to be leading, those that ought to be standing up to evil, those that ought to be standing up to anarchy, they ought to be the ones to restore order, to bring civility to the community. But instead, there's just weakness, there's timidity, there's paralysis, there's inaction, there's fear. What happens when the head is sick, when society lacks proper direction? Well, what happens when you lack that direction in the home? When you don't have proper God-fearing leadership in the home? What happens is that the family is turned upside down, just like Isaiah 3 prophesies. Go over and study that. Isaiah 3, I mentioned it there at the top. But Isaiah 3 verses 1 through 12, it describes what we're seeing. It describes what we're seeing in the home, what's happened in the home in the last 2 or 3 generations. And now it shouldn't be a surprise when we see it spilling into the streets. These youths, these young people have lacked direction in the home. And really, the leaders in Israel have encouraged it by encouraging parents to remove all restraint, by removing any kind of obstacle that might be there to prevent divorce, let's say. We've just made it so easy for families, for marriages to fall apart, and have insisted really that parents remove all discipline and order. And then they come into the streets in their chaotic and disorganized way. And what should we expect? Well, they're going to behave the same way they've been taught to behave, or not taught to behave, depending on how you look at it. Taking that same approach, that same violent, evil, selfish, self-absorbed mentality right into the streets without restraint. That's what we're seeing. You can expect when the head is sick, when the body's sick, you can expect for chaos to reign. Verse 7, "Your country is desolate, your cities are burned with fire. Your land," it says, "strangers devour it in your presence, and it is desolate as overthrown by strangers." So because of our national sins, because of this weakness that we see in so many of our leaders today, large cities are going to experience desolation and burning because of it. That's what God has prophesied. That's what Isaiah has prophesied. This is an end-time book. There's a lot of passages in the book of Isaiah that can prove that for you. It's for our day. Cities, you see, to be left desolate and in burning, and primarily brought on because of strangers in our midst. That's just talking about Gentiles, or the non-Israelites, in other words, those that are fueling these fires. Now look at what happened in London recently, where you had, or you saw, the grotesque sickness among the leadership, right at the very top. The ruling elites, the leaders, as I said at the start, many of them white, lacking the willpower, lacking the strength to actually lead, to actually meet that aggression, that evil aggression with force, and to put a stop to it. Or what little show of force they had was much too little too late, as the mobs were just led to believe there's nothing really that's going to happen here except for a slap on the wrist. So what would you think would happen if there's nothing but a slap on the wrist? You would expect then for mobs to rule. Mob rule. That's what we saw, where the police were just overwhelmed by the violence, by the looting, by the stealing, and so on. That's what we saw, weak leadership. And then on the streets in Britain's biggest cities, you saw these angry, rebellious mobs, and many of them, as that one quote brings out, many of them black. What has happened to black families, to our youths in the inner city? Who's courageous enough to step forward in the political realm and to deal with that, and to speak openly and frankly, and to base the teaching, the instruction on the Word of God? Families have just disintegrated in the inner city, and children are left to roam the streets and to terrorize the general public. That's what we're seeing, trying to bring down the government, really. Now, we don't take sides in this debate, this ongoing debate between the races. Our best explanation on this subject can be found in this little booklet. Actually, it's a fairly big booklet, Ezekiel, the end-time prophet. As we've been talking about this, the violence that's going to spread into our cities for decades, 20 years, more than 20 years, if you go back to the days of Herbert W. Armstrong. We don't take sides in the debate between races. The root cause here of all of this evil, the root cause of racial division, is man's heart. It doesn't have to do with the color of our skin. It has to do with the evil, rebellious heart that dwells in all of mankind. Look at Jeremiah 17:9, Romans 8:7. The evil and the wickedness that's in there, because we've drifted so far from our God. If anything, these prophecies really do pin they pin the problem on the ineffective leadership in Israelitish nations, the weak-kneed leaders who won't stand up and confront evil and then themselves obey God's laws. And so we see what's happening. There's been plenty of previews of this, not just London recently, but this booklet that I showed to you, and you can get a free copy of this at the end of the program. When you call the number on your screen, ask for that Ezekiel booklet. But in the 4th chapter of that booklet, we talk about what happened in 1992 with the Los Angeles riots, and how that was a small preview of what was coming to other cities. And now look at what's happened in London more recently, and even this summer with racially charged violence in places like Milwaukee here in the States, or in Philadelphia, putting out curfews just to keep the youths, many of them black, off the streets to preserve the peace. Scary what's happening in cities. You think there's people in London today who aren't just a little bit scared about what might happen to their homes or their shops? Who is behind this? That's really the cause. That nature, and then of course that very real being who is Satan the devil. He's the one who's fueling these fires, these racial wars that we're going to experience and see. The hatred and the animosity, the division in the home, the weakness among leaders, the weak-willed men who won't stand up and lead. Why is it the strongest quotes I have to give to you nearly always come from women? The two that I gave you at the top, two women who are pretty sharp. Where are the men talking about these problems, identifying the problems? There's a few, I suppose, but not nearly enough, who will speak up and tell this world what's wrong with our society. I mean, the British Prime Minister talked about how society in Britain is sick. It's sick. But where are the answers? Where are the solutions to the sickness? At least he sees a sickness. But there's also an inability, just like we saw in Los Angeles in 1992 when they were pleading with celebrities to try to calm people down, instead of confronting the evil. That's only going to make it spread. That's why it's been spreading. That's why we've been talking about it for as long as we have been. Verse 8, it says, "And the daughter of Zion is left as a cottage in a vineyard, as a lodge in a garden of cucumbers, as a besieged city, God's own people." Even as our cities are beginning to explode, some of God's people who've known what Mr. Armstrong said, who've known what we've said for 2 decades, still, though, they're out there sitting on the fence, paralyzed by inaction, just like so many of our government leaders are paralyzed by political correctness or whatever else. So many of God's people know, they know there's some deep-seated problems that are about to explode in our faces. They've got to act, though. Verse 9, it says, "Except the Lord of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant, we should have been as Sodom, and we should have been like unto Gomorrah." See, except for what God's doing through a very small remnant of people, our whole society, as the prophet describes here, is going the way of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what Jesus said as well. That's what we see as a result of this sick leadership. Verse 10, "Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. See, God, again, he draws attention to the rulers, the leaders. Where is the leadership? Where is the strength? Where is the character, the righteousness, the upholding of the rule of law? Where is that? It says, give ear unto the law of our God, you people of Gomorrah. God says, give ear unto the law. If you lose that respect for law, what are you left with besides anarchy? You know where it's headed just in looking at history. But added to that, we see these prophecies as well, where God's talking about a sickness, an inherent evil that dwells within the heart of man, and in particular in the people of Israel today, our peoples. You see it. You see it in the breakdown of the traditional family unit. You see it in the upside-down society that Isaiah 3 describes. You see it in the soft, cowardly leadership. You see it in the deep racial divisions. And all of this is leading to destruction. Look at Ezekiel chapter 5. Verse 1, it says, and you, son of man, take you a sharp knife, take you a barber's razor, and cause it to pass upon your head and upon your beard, and take you balances to weigh and divide the hair. You shall burn with fire a third part in the midst of the city, when the days of the siege are fulfilled, and you shall take a third part and smite about it with a knife, and a third part you shall scatter in the wind, and I will draw out a sword after them. So God here is dividing the destruction of our peoples into thirds. Into thirds. The first third, it says here, is burned by fire and violence. Now this is what's prophesied to happen in our cities, our major cities, our big cities, in the lead up to and during the Great Tribulation. That's also prophesied. The worst time of suffering this planet has ever seen. Matthew 24, verses 21 through 22. Let me quote to you now from that Ezekiel booklet I held up a moment ago. My Father says, the first third is burned with fire in the midst of the city, which is under siege. The burning is related to a siege. He says, Herbert Armstrong prophesied for many years that the siege would be our economy being battered by foreign competition. And as the U.S. and Britain become less and less competitive worldwide, unemployment will steadily increase. As that happens, domestic rioting and violence will become much more prevalent. Now, my father said that back in 2002, almost 10 years ago. In fact, all the way back in 1992, when he wrote another book on the prophet Ezekiel's message. He said much the same thing. He said, as the economy grows worse, or is under siege, the rioters will burn more and more because God's wrath is upon us. That's from 1992. Writing partly in response to the riots we saw in Los Angeles. And they're in that first version of the Ezekiel booklet that we produced. Rioting and how it's going to increase. As things get worse, as the economy worsens, as unemployment increases, then you're going to see more violence, more fighting in the streets. See, when times are good, it's easier, isn't it, for the deep racial divisions to sort of hide beneath the surface. But when they get bad, when times get bad, you're going to see those problems come to the surface very quickly. Verse 12, it says, a third part of you shall die with the pestilence, and with famine shall they be consumed in the midst of you, and a third part shall fall by the sword round about you, and I will scatter a third part into all the winds, and I will draw out a sword after them. Again, we're focusing more on the first third. You can read the Ezekiel booklet to read about all three, all of those thirds. But with this first third, you read about the fire in verse 2, and here it talks about the pestilence and then the famine, in that order. The pestilence leading to the famine. Pestilence just means destruction or death. It doesn't necessarily have to do with physical disease. It's just talking about violence, really. Pestilence, violence, a violence of burning. Back to the booklet, this pestilence or plague of violence will cause many health problems that lead to famine. He says a little further down, society will unravel and the collective panic will bring a stock market disaster. It will get so bad that violence and famine will take millions of lives. Millions of lives. That's what this is leading to. He says the Los Angeles rioting is just a type of what's going to happen in major cities. In the whole nation. See, it's a preview. That's what we were saying 20 years ago after Los Angeles. Now look at London. Well, they're to host the Olympics next year, and they're worried. And they should be. They should be concerned about their streets. Continuing from the booklet, terrorist attacks, rioting, and burning are the main thrust of the pestilence mentioned in Ezekiel 5. And this rioting will spread to other Israelite nations unless people repent. God will get our attention one way or another. The worse the violence and burning becomes, the worse the famine will get. The worse the famine becomes, the more intensive the violence will get. It becomes a vicious cycle. It becomes a vicious, vicious cycle. Now I'll leave it to you to look at Ezekiel 7 and verse 15. That just brings out how that this first third, again, it's going to be concentrated primarily on the cities, the bigger cities. That's not to say that those outside of the cities are left out of God's corrective hand. I mean, they're going to receive correction too. But it's divided into thirds, as Ezekiel 5 brings out. The seeds, this is on page 35 of our booklet, the seeds of this future calamity have already been sown. And that's what that woman said just recently, writing about London. We're reaping what we've sown. We said this 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The seeds of this future calamity have already been sown. Listen to this. The government has lost control. There is a breakdown of law and order. When the riots in Los Angeles were at their peak, government authorities asked black sports stars and other leading blacks to plead with their people to stop the rioting. There was virtually no show of governmental force. In the future, notice this is from 10 years ago, 20 years ago initially. In the future, when this violence spreads, will this be our main hope for peace? How pathetic, he writes. We're dangerously close to social anarchy and chaos. You see, we've been saying this for decades. We're dangerously close to this social anarchy and chaos. Now, as I said, we're not here to take sides with any particular color or race, whether it's with the weak-kneed leaders in Israel today who won't enforce the rule of law, or whether it's the rebellious elements of the inner city who have no respect for government and authority. In either case, you see, it's the nature of man, the heart of man, that needs to change. Now, we've got a PDF that we want for you to get. We've offered this before, A Nation Without Natural Affection. We offered it before, I guess, a few weeks back, but there's an article in the back of this about why mankind cannot solve its problems. Never before understood, Mr. Armstrong wrote, why humanity cannot solve its evils. This explains why what is happening, and why man has been unable to solve the problems that we see now exploding in our major cities all over the place. That, together with this booklet, the Ezekiel, the End Time Prophet booklet, you can get both of these by simply calling the number on your screen right now, and we'll send them both out to you right away. Otherwise, you can go to thetrumpetdaily.com and download both copies for you immediately if you'd like to continue your study now. As always, we thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning.